Hi there. In this video, we're going to be talking about the global war of the Cold War from 1955 through to 1963. So things that this will cover will include Cuba, it will include Khrushchev versus Kennedy, the uprisings that took place in Europe, the summits, Vietnam, and then rivalries in terms of the arms race, the space race, Berlin, and obviously ultimately finishing on Cuba, which is the first case study that I talked about. Right, so with the global war, we're now kind of edging in towards the hot point, really, of the Cold War. And people say that 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, was that flashpoint where brinkmanship and mutually assured destruction was at its height. You could compare this, though, I think, with 1983. 1983, I think, is probably one of the worst years for the Cold War because you've got a heightened Second Cold War. Reagan and Thatcher are really ramping up neoliberalism and changing their stance towards the Soviet Union. And then you have a number of nuclear accidents that almost escalate into war. I think comparing 62 Cuba and 1983 is really interesting because we all pin our kind of thoughts on the Cold War being ultimately tested in 1962, but I think it continued to test us right up into the 1980s with the Second Cold War. Anyway, let's start first of all with 1953 to 55, which in essence is the death of Stalin and the arrival of Nikita Khrushchev. Now, I rate kind of Khrushchev and his stance towards policies with the West. He is eventually the person that takes leadership control of the Soviet Union. When Stalin dies, there's a film about the death of Stalin, but when Stalin dies, there is a power struggle between the leaders of the Soviet Union, and it is eventually settled in 1955 when Khrushchev becomes the Soviet leader. When he does, he immediately thinks about how to represent himself and the Soviet Union as a kind of like new wave or a new age. And I think the global Cold War, this 55 to 63, is Khrushchev's Cold War. It's his ownership, and most of the time the Soviet Union are on top. So looking at the previous two videos we've looked at with origins and widening, it's always the Americans kind of responding and then cracking down and dealing with communism. 55 to 63, I think, is Khrushchev testing the USA and getting to a point where the Soviets are now emerging on top. So what does Khrushchev do at the 20th Party Congress? He does two things. He announces his policy of peaceful coexistence. Now, peaceful coexistence is unpacked into a variety of different things, but peaceful coexistence, in essence, is this idea that the Soviet Union is looking at friendly competition with the West. They're no longer going to see America as this evil that needs to be destroyed, which is what Stalin considered, but they're going to talk diplomatically with the Americans. And we'll see that through some of the examples that I'm going to talk about in a moment. So peaceful coexistence was this idea that the Soviets would be the ultimate Soviet socialist leaders in the world, massive snub to China, who were their friends from 1950. The Eastern Bloc was going to be tightened in terms of control, which we see with Poland and Hungary. Germany was going to remain unarmed and ideally within the Soviet realm of influence. They were going to increase their military so that they could compete with the Americans, and they were going to acknowledge that America existed. In essence, they were going to compete for the top spot around the world, to be that kind of global power. Now, there was a second part of that 20th Party Conference, which was looking at the secret speech, which is where Khrushchev de-Stalinizes the Soviet Union, and in essence, the whole world. He criticises Stalin's control, he criticises the apparatus of power, the camps. Instantly, the gulags are opened and all the people that have been imprisoned in there are given a pardon to release them. And for the West, they see this as a softening of the Soviet Union, and they think this is their opportunity to take advantage of it. It was a secret speech because it was part of the announcement that wasn't supposed to leak out to the West. However, eventually it does trickle down because of the actions of Khrushchev. For Khrushchev, de-Stalinization is a leadership move. It's a way for him to create his own cult of personality. He does dismantle parts of the oppressive regime that Stalin had set up, but he wasn't going to let go of Eastern Europe. So the secret speech was a way for Khrushchev to assert control more than relaxing control, which is how the West eventually perceived it. Right, knock-on impacts then. So we talked about this speech in 1956. That leads to two uprisings in Europe. But before we talk about that, let's talk a little bit about peaceful coexistence happening before the speech even takes place. In 1955, there are two incidences. One is the Austrian State Treaty. Austria was divided, just like Germany, into zones. And then what happened in 1955 is they negotiated, all of the allies, about allowing Austria to decide their own fate. Austria decided that they were going to remain neutral, and all of the allies walked away from Austria. It is an outstanding example of diplomacy and peaceful relations in a Cold War world. The second thing to talk about really with 1955 is the Geneva Summit. This follows the Geneva Conference from 54, where they split Vietnam into half and talk about the elections in 56. But the Geneva Summit was designed to be a moment where Khrushchev could talk to the Americans. And it was a kind of first initial stage in opening up this friendly dialogue. They discussed two things, and both of them failed. One was open skies, this idea that you could look at each other's countries from above to see how many bombers there were and how many planes and air bases and so on. The Americans wanted to do it because they wanted to ensure that the missile and bomber gap weren't as large. I suppose it's the bomber gap at this point, because the Gator report hasn't been written yet from 57. So the Soviets turn it down instantly. They're like, well, we don't want you spying in our country. It's not as if they've not already been doing that, America. And then what comes next is the discussion of Germany, and that would plague a lot of what the global war was all about. Germany, the Americans wanted free elections and for Germany to eventually, I suppose, join NATO. That was their plan. The Soviets would only talk about Germany if it meant demilitarizing them and allowing them to remain neutral. Sticking point, and we would keep coming back to Germany in 1958 and eventually in 1961 during this time period. So we've got some early examples here of friendship. Now the thorn that starts to build with Germany comes with something known as the Holstein Doctrine. It was devised by the West German authorities, the Federal Republic of Germany, the FRG, and the reasoning behind that was they basically didn't want anyone to recognise the GDR, East Germany. So the Holstein Doctrine said if anyone acknowledges the GDR, you could cut ties with Western Germany, we won't talk to you again. The only country that did recognise the GDR was Russia. So that became an issue, really, and Holstein would be tested when it came to the Berlin Wall in 61. Let's come back to that. So 1956, de-Stalinisation has happened. Poland and Hungary think this is their opportunity. Poland goes first. There is an uprising in Poland which starts with a group of workers in Gdansk. I apologise because I've pronounced that wrong. But the workers are demanding better wages and better working conditions, as a lot of Eastern Europe want as well at this point. And a leader called Gomulka will eventually take charge, and he becomes the leader of the Polish Communist Party, and he supports this idea. It's a threat to the Soviet Union's control over Poland. However, it is actually successful. The Chinese step in, exerting their influence around the world as a communist leader, and they back Poland over this. So long as Poland don't walk away from the Soviet Union or the Communist Party completely, they leave them alone. So things do improve in Poland slightly as a consequence of this uprising. We then move on to Hungary, who look at what happened to Poland and think, oh, well, hold on, the Polish have been able to get some slight improvements in their working conditions. We want that as well. Now, Hungary is slightly different because they originally had a communist leader called Rákosi. Rákosi was the guy that talked about salami tactics. That was his quote about chopping up Europe like salami. He's replaced in October 1956 by Imre Nagy. Nagy is a liberal thinker. He still believes in socialism, but actually he doesn't want Hungary to be part of the Eastern Bloc. He wants Hungary to be like Austria. He wants Hungary to be neutral. So he starts to introduce things like free elections. He wants the Soviet Union to withdraw from Hungary. He wants the Soviet army to back away. He wants private ownership, which is kind of a capitalist idea that the Soviets wouldn't be happy with. And he wants to leave the Warsaw Pact. And therein lies the problem. Khrushchev is seen to dither on this, and the Allies think, ooh, this could be something that is done quite well. The Chinese try to respond as well, but Initially, Khrushchev backs it, and then the moment it looks like they're going to leave the Warsaw Pact, they cannot allow a country like Hungary and where it's located to become a vessel for the West. And so they send in their tanks and they crush the revolution. And quite a number of people are arrested. Náš himself is arrested, then executed, and he's replaced by a hardline socialist called János Kadar. And Kadar will be in charge of Hungary right the way through until Hungary eventually will move away from the Soviet Union's control. So we have two uprisings taking place as a result of de-Stalinisation. Next up, we have then an example of cooperation. We've got 1959's Camp David talks. Eisenhower is in a position to invite Khrushchev over to America. First Soviet leader to arrive in America. Big step, big move. Camp David is a little private retreat where presidents usually meet dignitaries, and during the talks they discuss Berlin. They talk about disarmament and making sure that Berlin doesn't become a kind of hotbed for the Cold War. It ends in nothing because they can't really agree on what should happen with Berlin. There is a rift with China because they don't like the fact that the Soviets are talking to the Americans. But the progress from Camp David, although nothing's agreed, it leads the way to the Paris summit in 1960, the big one. And there's all hopes on what's going to happen in Paris. And in May 1960, the Paris summit is agreed. At this point, it's Eisenhower still in charge, even though we know that Kennedy's round the corner because he wins the election in 1960. Previously, China had not had any... China were in a position where they didn't want to negotiate with the West. They had a fractious relationship with the Soviets, and this all stems from the fact that the Soviets still saw themselves as the top communist country. China believed that they were the top communist country, but the Soviets decided to give them help. What they did was they sent some advisors to China, but in return they took a lot of resources out of China. And then when Mao was sent over to Moscow to meet with Stalin put Mao's contingent up in quite a rough hotel, and Mao got very upset that he was made to feel like a second-class citizen. So when Khrushchev visits Beijing, Mao does the same thing. He disrespects Khrushchev. And there's this famous story of how Khrushchev goes to meet with Mao. Mao has his meeting in a swimming pool. Mao's an excellent swimmer. Swims around Khrushchev, who's floundering around in the pool. And it's just an example, really, of the fractious relationship between the Soviet Union and the Chinese at this point. But Paris then adds to this in 1960. They're very close to completing their nuclear arsenal, the Chinese, in 1960, so they don't therefore want anything to rock the boat in terms of their alliances, and Paris would do that. Paris looked so optimistic, and then it's blown out of the water because of the U-2 spy plane incident. The Americans have been spying on the Soviets to find out how many missiles, how many bombers they have, and how many nukes they've got, and they're caught. Khrushchev has the spy plane, the U-2 spy plane, and he has Gary Powers, the pilot. He doesn't tell the Americans, he keeps the trump card. And then when he announces it at the Paris summit in 1960, the Americans, Eisenhower lies basically and says that it was a weather balloon, the classic story. And then he says, well, here's Gary, here's the plane wreckage, and here's the photos from your spy plane. The Americans are caught red-handed. Khrushchev is riding high in 1960. He's crushed uprisings, he's de-Stalinised, he's made the Americans look like fools, and he walks away from the Paris summit. This is building up to something. By 1961, Kennedy becomes the new president of America, and we have a clash of relations. The issue with Kennedy is that he reaffirms the Truman Doctrine. He says that if anyone needs support, America's here. He increases defence budget spending, and so there's an arms race building again in 1961. And we talk a lot about, was their friendship growing? There are definite examples of cooperation, as we saw earlier with 55 and 59, but now by 1961, Kennedy is upping the game. At the Vienna summit in 1961, nothing is agreed there again. It's a meeting between the two leaders, Khrushchev and Kennedy, for the first time. Khrushchev walks away thinking he can control Kennedy. He's young, he's inexperienced, he's naive, and he failed to deal with the Cuban uprising that's taken place. We'll talk about Cuba in a second. But in 1961, the Bay of Pigs incident takes place, where Cuban exiles trained by the CIA are landed in Cuba to retake the island, and it catastrophically fails, and the Americans are to blame for it, or accused of blame. After the summit, Kennedy asks NATO to start building their forces up in Europe. And as a consequence, this leads us to the next two topics. The rivalries between the USA and USSR are seen in the Berlin Crisis of 1958 and Cuba. So Berlin. We've seen so far that Berlin has been an issue since the conferences. The blockade was the next big issue. Now we get to 1958. There was an issue in 1953 over political uprisings and freedoms for the people, and that was crushed quite quickly. It's not mentioned in many books that we certainly use in school anyway, but just so you're aware of, Berlin has constantly been a bit of an issue all the way along the line. But in 58 it becomes a hot point, because in Berlin in 1958 there is the discussion over two stances. The Americans again still want to develop Western Germany, and the Soviets want to demilitarize it and neutralize it completely. And so with Germany, in particular Berlin, Khrushchev is looking for a boost against the Sino-Soviet relations that are deteriorating, and he needs to win some sort of victory in Europe. So in November 1958, he decides to announce that he's given a 6-month ultimatum to West Berlin forces, basically to the west, to get out, clear off. And what he wants is the GDR to take full control of Berlin, because the GDR are aligned with the Soviet Union, which means that the Soviets would have full control over Berlin. It's rejected within a month, and what the West do is that they start to kind of support Berlin over backing them. 1960, don't forget, is just after the Berlin Crisis, so 58. By 1959, you have Camp David. The West German government are feeling like the Americans and the Brits are betraying them here. 1960, the Paris summit falls apart, and as a result, in 1961, the Berlin Wall is built. Why? It's mostly because there are two reasons. One is because the Soviets believe it will be an anti-fascist protection barrier, that's what they call it, and it will block fascism from seeping into the East. The secret reason is because there's a brain drain going on. Thousands of incredibly skilled workers are fleeing East Germany through East Berlin and then going into the West. From West Berlin, they can then leave to go westward, looking for better pay and conditions. So on the 13th of August, overnight in 1961, the East German authorities seal off West Berlin, and they build a wall around it. And that wall is originally done in quite quick barbed wire fencing, then it's concrete, and over time they add lots of death strips, vehicle hedgehogs that prevent tanks and cars from driving, and they militarize that area. There is a great story connected to that, which is called Tunnel 29. The BBC have done like a podcast series on that, and there's a book that's come out about Tunnel 29. It's brilliant. And there's a memorial plaque to Tunnel 29's entrance in Berlin if you ever visit. However, for Kennedy, it kind of is a win. The Berlin Wall stops all these refugees fleeing into the West, which they don't know what to do with, and it avoids war. So the Berlin Wall is allowed to be where it is, but he does visit in 1963, and he does announce that he is a jelly donut. It's a story about Ich bin ein Berliner. I am a Berliner, we are all Berliners, Berlin will eventually be free, is what he was saying. And there was an anecdotal story about how a Berliner in West Berlin is supposedly a jelly donut. So there was that funny anecdotal story, which is not true, but a lovely one. Okay, next rivalries then come with two other incidences. Cuba will leave to the end. We've got Asia and what happens with Kennedy in Asia, but let's go back to this idea of rivalry with the arms race and ultimately the space race. So again, looking at this global perspective, we've talked about what's going on in Europe. We've talked a little bit about summits and conferences falling apart. Now let's have a look at the arms race and space race. For the arms race, what happens is in the 1950s, 54 and 55, a hydrogen bomb is developed. It is developed in 54 by the Americans and the Soviets, and by 55 an airborne H-bomb is available. It's something on the lines of 1,500 times more powerful than the atomic bomb used at Hiroshima, and it would prove deadly. It would lead to a huge arms race in terms of making sure that each side had enough to counter the other. You only really need one of these things to make some element of damage. In 1957, though, an ICBM was developed by the Russians and the Americans. An intercontinental ballistic missile means that it could launch from one country and hit another one without using bombers. The Gator report of 57 claimed that the Russians had got 100 to 30 missile lead over the Americans, instigating a vast arms race. Immediate range missiles were then dropped off in Britain so that they could be used to attack the Soviets if they ever launched. And by 1959, ICBMs were then kind of added to with SLBMs, submarine launched ballistic missiles. And at this point, the arms race really does become quite mad. This then moves into the space race, because in 1957 we have the launch of Sputnik, which is the first satellite that can orbit the Earth. The Americans are absolutely devastated that if they can put a satellite in space, can they put missiles or a missile platform in space? And so let's go for a rundown of space race events. In October we have Sputnik, 1957. November, the first animal, the dog, Laika, is put up into space. In December, the Americans try for the first time to launch, and it explodes on the launch pad. Hence, the Soviets called it Flopnik. In 1958, NASA is formed to coordinate the space agency in America. In 1950, basically, it's Russia wins all of this. I'm afraid the space race is won by Russia. In 1959, they've got landing on the moon. A vehicle lands on the moon. They orbit the moon. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin is the first human in space. A month later, Alan Shepard, the Americans catch up. In 1963, the first female is launched into space, Valentina Tereshkova. And then in 1965, the USSR does their first spacewalk. This then continues. Eventually, the Americans start to catch up and they orbit the moon in 68. And then we obviously have the moon landings in July 1969. Do the Americans win the space race? Absolutely not. Everything was Soviet until they landed on the moon. But the space race, it embarks this idea that the Cold War really has become a race, and a technological race at that. Okay, so we covered this idea of rivalry from Berlin, coming from failure in the conferences and the summits. We've talked about the rivalry continuing with an arms race. Now let's have a look at that rivalry, which ends with two final events. One of them is the development of Asia, Vietnam, and the final one being Cuba. Okay, so Asia. Those free elections that we thought were going to take place in 1956, they don't take place because it looks very much like the Soviets are going to win. And so they're cancelled. A democratic election is cancelled by a democratic party, by a democratic country, America. By cancelling those elections, it signifies that this is not, that they're going to do anything they can to block the rollout of communism across Asia. North Vietnam meets in 1959 to discuss their 4-point strategy, and their 4-point strategy is all about removing foreign interference and allowing the Vietnamese to sort their own problems out. Remember this, because eventually in 1975, the North Vietnamese will meet with the Americans and say, look, we said all of this stuff in the start. If you guys hadn't have interfered, we'd have dealt with this. Right, so the aim behind the North was to unify Vietnam, and they wanted to remove what they saw as an undemocratic DM, Ngo Dinh Diem, who's working for the South Vietnamese, and is incredibly nepotistic, and he's corrupt, and it really makes the Americans look quite weak because he's so corrupt. In 1960, the National Liberation Front is formed in the north, and they use the Viet Cong in the south to launch attacks on the South Vietnamese government. Training, money and advisors are dumped on Vietnam because they can't interfere. The Americans don't interfere because there's no need to, there's no cause to do so. So they start backing the South Vietnamese government as best as possible. In 1962, Kennedy comes up with a strategic hamlet program where they create 3,000 hamlet villages in South Vietnam to root out the Viet Cong, and it completely fails because how can you tell who's Viet Cong? So they literally moved these villages up from their original villages, and moved them elsewhere to protect them, in essence carrying the Viet Cong with them. In 1963, we then have the Buddhist crisis, where the Catholic Diem regime cracks down on Buddhism hard, and as a consequence, Buddhist monks go on protest. The most extreme protests involve self-immolation, the burning of monks in streets. It leads to a crisis point, and eventually there is a coup against Diem, and Diem is assassinated. The finger points really at the Americans supporting a South Vietnamese coup, but it does play into their hands. In 1963, Kennedy is also assassinated, and then that leads to major shifts in Vietnam, including the invasion of Vietnam in 1964. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the development of Vietnam. But for now, to finish in 1963, let's have a look at Cuba. Cuba is the high point, as I said at the start of this video, and it looks at how brinkmanship was ultimately tested. In January 1959, Che Guevara and Fidel Castro lead a revolution and topple the Batista American-backed government. Cuba had been supported by the Americans and traded with the Americans openly for years. And in 1959, that changes. The Soviet Union see an opportunity here because the Americans have placed missiles in Turkey a few years back. The Soviets now have a major opportunity to strike a really good blow. And again, Khrushchev seems to be on the rise. What they do is they support monetarily Cuba, who are really struggling to keep going, and so they buy their export sugar, and in return they send military equipment to prevent an invasion. The Bay of Pigs instigates this in 1961, and then Operation Mongoose, all the different attempts that Kennedy tries to make to assassinate or remove Castro, fails, which instigates this idea that Cuba is under threat. The Soviets use that as an excuse to then send the military equipment, in particular nuclear equipment. It all comes to a head in October 1962 when a U-2 spy plane spots missile silos in Cuba. This then starts 13 days of confrontation between the Soviets and the Americans. Eventually a blockade is put across Cuba to prevent nuclear material arriving in Cuba. America goes to DEFCON 2, which means that they're ready to invade, they're ready to launch attacks, planes are in the air. And what happens is Khrushchev blinks. Khrushchev sends various telegrams to America. The Americans sit on them, but privately will agree to remove the missiles from Turkey, and publicly they will not invade Cuba. Khrushchev turns the ships around and heads back to the Soviet Union. Khrushchev, a year later, will lose his job over his decision in what is seen to be weakness in turning a blind eye. Khrushchev will always say that he was the bigger person and resolve the situation with diplomacy. As a consequence of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963, we have the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty signed, which finally, I suppose, understands the dangers of such technology, and they ban the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere and underwater. And then finally, we have the ultimate, really, in cooperation, which is the hotline. A telephone line is installed in the White House and in the Kremlin so that the Americans could talk to the Soviets and likewise, to avoid any such incident happening again. That whistle-stop run-through of these events is the high point of the Cold War at this point. So from 55 to 63, we have again new leaders, Kennedy and Khrushchev, wanting to prove themselves. We have confrontation in Europe, which is squashed. We have the emergence of more rivalry, but equally a sense of hope, visiting each other's countries, going to summits. That will pave the way for the détente period we see in the 1970s. Thank you very much for listening.